Alright, let's talk about the types of hazardous waste. There's 4 types that we can discuss. The first one is transuranic waste, also called true waste. Alright, this is waste that was produced from the construction of nuclear weapons prior to 1963, when the United States was developing nuclear weapons. This consists not only of nuclear fuel and the nuclear warheads themselves when they're decommissioned, but also the gloves, the hats, the lab coats, the equipment, the booties that they wear on the shoes. Anything needs to go into these 55-gallon drums and be stored and managed as transuranic waste. They choose these 55-gallon drums to store and to ship hazardous materials because they're secure. Alright, so transuranic waste is the first type of waste that we can look at. Second type would be industrial waste. Anything generated in the manufacturing of goods. Alright, and that means things like lubricants in the machines that are used to produce our goods, cleaning products, solvents. Sometimes there's byproducts of generating other materials. Alright, so just kind of realize in the manufacturing of our goods and services, there's a lot of different chemicals used, or there's byproducts generated in industry. Okay, so for an example, perchloroethylene, also called PERC, is a known carcinogen, and it's used in the dry cleaning business. Okay, so dry cleaners produce and use a lot of perchloroethylene, and then that needs to be disposed of as hazardous waste. Perchloroethylene is a soluble cancer-causing agent that gets into the water supply and then causes cancers. So just for an example of an industrial waste, PERC is one that you can jot down. Alright, but there's many. Alright, then you have household wastes. These are the ones that you and I both have in our homes. Alright, we're talking mainly about insecticides or pesticides. We're talking about cleaning supplies and cleaning products, solvents, paints, alright, sealants, paint thinners, degreasers, adhesives, lacquer. We all have this stuff on the shelves of our garages, in the cabinets of our kitchens and bathrooms. Alright, these are the things that when burned, when incinerated, they cause dioxins. When disposed of in a landfill, they create toxic leachate. Alright, so these things cannot be thrown out. Alright, and then you have low-level and high-level radioactive waste. Low-level radioactive waste is anything that's been contaminated. Alright, so we're talking about gloves, shoes, clothing, rags, swabs, needles, lab animals. So in nuclear medicine, there's a lot of hazardous, low-level hazardous radioactive waste generated. So anything that's been contaminated can range from just above background levels to highly radioactive. But we consider that low-level radioactive waste, because high-level radioactive waste is your spent nuclear fuel. Alright, in the generation of nuclear energy, you have spent fuel rods, and you also have a lot of water. So we consider that high-level radioactive waste, these spent fuel rods and the water. There's a lot of it being generated in our nuclear power plants across the country. When it comes to high-level radioactive waste, there's really not much you can do with it. The only way it can become decontaminated is through decay. Alright, and that can take tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So really the only thing we can do is store it. And that becomes an issue with both low-level and high-level radioactive waste. Alright, you could throw true waste, transuranic waste in here. The only thing we can do with it is store it. Alright, so those are a little bit about the types of wastes that we're talking about. So we can go ahead now and talk about the couple of laws that manage these types of waste. And the first one is RCRA. You need to know these laws. Passed in 1976, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act basically defined what hazardous waste is. Alright, prior to that, people knew what hazardous waste was, but what RCRA is going to do is, through defining hazardous waste, and probably more importantly requiring a legal paper trail, we can now hold individuals and companies and industries accountable for its proper management and disposal. So now we have cradle to grave accountability. So very important law is RCRA. Alright, so take a look at this paper trail here. You have a company at the bottom that is generating a product and that is manufacturing a product, and in doing so they generate some hazardous waste. Alright, that hazardous waste must be documented, what it is, the date it was manufactured or generated. It then needs to have a paper trail when it's being transported to storage. Alright, that paper needs to follow it as it then becomes transported to a treatment facility where it's made less hazardous, or it's made back into some type of raw material that could be used again. Alright, the rest of it that cannot be recycled, that paper trail needs to follow it to the grave. Alright, and the EPA needs to be alerted and aware all along the way. So this paper trail becomes extremely important because now there is a record of when it was manufactured, what it is, who manufactured it, where it's going, where it's stored, where its grave is in a secure landfill, and the EPA knows about it. Alright, this is proper management of hazardous wastes. Alright, an example of a paper trail is an MSDS, a Material Safety Data Sheet. This is one example of a paper trail, and this is one that we use at school. We have a chemical closet with all kinds of chemicals for the science department, and this material safety data sheet will tell you the characteristics of the hazards involved. It'll tell you the name of it, it'll tell you the expiration date, it'll tell you the manufacturer, it'll tell you proper disposal methods, it'll tell you everything you need to know about this material. Alright, so this is an example, not the only example, but the MSDS is an example of accountability when it comes to hazardous materials. We need to make sure that they're being transported properly. So not only storage do we need to know what's in these barrels and the expiration dates and that kind of thing, but also in transport. Alright, so drivers need to sign off what they're carrying, when they're carrying it, to whom they're carrying it to. It needs to be signed off when it's delivered. And just for an FYI, if you ever see a tanker truck on the road and it has this cage here, alright, that you know is delivering hazardous waste. Because if that tanker tips over, then that cage hopefully prevents the tanker from rupturing and having hazardous materials all over a highway or a roadway or in the environment. So if you see one of those tankers with a cage, you'll notice that it's also carrying hazardous waste. Alright, a second law. RCRA was the start. Alright, also in 1976 we have Tosca. Alright, the Toxic Substances Control Act. And what Tosca does in 1976, the EPA can now track the manufacture and import of different chemicals. Alright, not only can the EPA track manufacture and import of chemicals, but it can also require testing and reports regarding the safety of those materials. Alright, but I guess more importantly, if the EPA deems a material or a certain toxin or chemical too dangerous, it can now ban the manufacture or the import of those materials. So Tosca becomes just another weapon for the EPA to manage and regulate some of these chemicals and toxins. Alright, third and last law that we can deal with hazardous waste is probably the more important one, CERCLA, also called the Superfund Law. Alright, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. Alright, let's break this down. Comprehensive Environmental Response. Alright, whenever you hear environmental response, what would you be responding to in the environment? We're talking about a spill, so this deals with cleanup. Alright, a spill or some type of contamination. We need to respond to that. But now, there's compensation and liability. Alright, companies are liable. What CERCLA does is it provides cleanup and it provides accountability. It is aimed at rapid containment and cleanup of abandoned waste sites. Okay? Under CERCLA, the government does not have to prove anyone violated the law or what role they played. Anyone associated with the site can be held accountable for the entire cost of cleaning it up. So what that means is, if you're the polluter and you know that there's barrels of hazardous waste buried on your site and you go to sell your property, the buyer better find out that that's there. All right, so it's buyer beware, because if the buyer buys it and there's a problem later on, the buyer, they could be held liable. All right, so it really can hold anyone accountable. So through the Superfund Law, and we call that the Superfund because there's literally a super fund out there. There's a big giant fund with a lot of money in it. All right, and when it started, it was the polluters who were paying into this fund. When it began, the polluters were paying. So they were putting money into this giant fund to help clean up the sites that they polluted. All right, that's since been changed, and it is now a taxpayer-driven fund. All right, so now it falls on the taxpayer to put money into this fund to clean up sites that industries have polluted. And the problem is the taxpayer does not have the money. Okay, so this fund is somewhat broken. All right, there's too many sites out there that are designated Superfund sites, but there's not enough money to clean them up. So what happens is the EPA prioritizes 1,000 sites. All right, we call that the National Priority List. All right, those top 1,000 sites are the only ones where there's money going into the cleanup of those sites. And those are designated by how close they are to people and is water supply contaminated. All right, so we're working with contaminated sites where those contaminants are soluble and it's close to a lot of people. Those are the ones that go on the national priority list. The other tens of thousands of sites that are out there are not being cleaned up. There's just not enough money. There's not enough manpower. The Superfund can only do so much. Okay, so hopefully you understand a little bit about Superfund. So here you go. Here's a little summary of the Superfund Law. Here are the national priority list sites, and if you look down the lower right, the blue cross are the ones that have been proposed. The green X's are the ones that are finished. They've been remedied. And the little stars are the ones that have been deleted. But I like this map because it shows the ones that are on the national priority list, but it also shows a nice cluster here. All right, what you should know is that the #1 state is New Jersey. New Jersey has the most Superfund sites in the country. The second, right behind New Jersey with the most Superfund sites, is Pennsylvania. Now this map is showing the national priority list sites, but in regards to Superfund sites, New Jersey is #1. It has the most polluted sites in the country, and Pennsylvania is right behind it with the second most polluted sites in the country. All right, not all of which are being cleaned up. And you can ask yourself, why do you think that is? And the answer is really just the storied history of industry and settlement in the New Jersey and Pennsylvania area. Just the sheer amount of industry of Philadelphia alone, and then up and down the Delaware River, gives this area such a rich industrial history, which in this case equals a rich polluted history. All right, if we look at Pennsylvania and the Superfund sites here, you see a lot are clustered down and around the Philadelphia area in and along the Delaware River, and you also see there's a bunch in Montgomery County here. All right, there's actually 12 in Montgomery County. And just to remind you, I did present this one to you before, the Superfund site in Palmerton, where there was a zinc factory nearby that was emitting some heavy metals, and it basically killed all the life on a nearby mountain, and it looks like a disaster area today. So you can go to this Superfund site and hike the Lehigh Canal trails, and then there's nearby trails walking through this site. But just to kind of look at this again, if you notice, there's not even soil in this area. The contamination of zinc and other heavy metals was so bad that it killed the bacteria in the soil, rendering the soil basically lifeless, deteriorating the quality of that soil, and the soil literally just blew away. All right, and there's nothing left. It's a barren, barren landscape. So what they're doing in this area is something called phytoremediation. They brought in plants that were used to absorb the zinc and other heavy metals in their roots. once those grasses and the plants that they used in the phytoremediation technique absorbed the zinc and other metals in their roots, then they were able to just harvest the plants, and they take that away and treat it as hazardous waste. But what they're doing is they're cleansing the immobile agents out of the soils and basically cleaning up the site at the same time. So they used phytoremediation techniques at this site, and it worked. It pretty much worked. The areas where there is no soil, the contamination is most likely gone with the soil, all right, washed down into the nearby Lehigh River, but there's no soil left to hold roots down or anything like that, so the area is basically left to succession to occur again. And a quick quiz: would it be primary succession or secondary succession in this case? You can answer that. All right. A lot of people talk about Superfund as being a broken law or ineffective, things like that, but what they don't realize is that there's a long, arduous process to get sites onto the Superfund list, and then an even tougher journey to get sites onto the national priority list. But, you know, site needs to be discovered. A lot of the sites in the United States that are contaminated, nobody says anything, or there's still industry operating there. All right, the site needs to be evaluated. All right, then it has to get onto the NPL listing if there's going to be any funding at all. And here's where most Superfund sites are basically stalled out. Once they're on that list, you know, then there needs to be an investigation on the techniques they're going to use to help clean it up. Then there's a feasibility study, a proposed plan, and so forth, on the actual cleanup itself until it's fixed, cleaned, and then deleted from the national priority list. Very long and arduous process, okay, of which there's very little money and a lot of political powers working at hand here with this process. Okay, so that's a little bit about Superfund sites. There's a second type of site you need to be aware of, and that's a brownfield. All right, a brownfield is simply an old industrial complex like Bethlem Steel. This is the picture you're looking at. All right, that industrial site is now, you know, closed, and the property which is contaminated wants to be redeveloped. All right, that's a brownfield. So in the case of Bethlem Steel, for over 100 years, they produced the world's best steel on this site next to the Lehigh River. The soil in the area is obviously contaminated from those 100+ years of manufacturing steel. All right, and the city of Bethlehem wanted to come in and redevelop the area. So that's what a brownfield is. All right, taking a contaminated area and redeveloping it. In the case of Bethlem Steel, it took years and years, all right, but you can see the blast furnaces here. They actually built a concert venue. This became a park down here with an outdoor concert venue here. And off the picture, there's a casino and a hotel. There's also some stores and shops but they're doing a real nice job here with Bethlem Steel redeveloping this brownfield. And I encourage you to go up and check this out because there's a lot to do. You can take a friend and go up there and shop at the outlet stores. You can enjoy a concert or a movie, or you can just hike around and look at the history of Bethlem Steel at this location. I encourage you to go in the summertime. They have made a deal with the city to have 100 free concerts at this venue, that place takes place right next to the blast furnaces. So here's a picture of it at night during a concert. All right. And in the inside of the building there, you can go in and get a coffee, and there's a movie theater in there. It's pretty impressive what they've done with this particular brownfield. But you can think of how many brownfields are in and around the Philadelphia area where the industries have shut down and the buildings in the area is just left there and contaminated. Think about Pittsburgh when Pittsburgh Steel shut down. Okay, lots of brownfields in and around the country.